We have now reviewed how an international human rights system of protection for freedom of expression has been established over the last 60 years or so. It includes conventions and mechanisms for their implementation at both international and regional level. Regional human rights systems are essential to international human rights protection and to that of freedom of expression in particular. Indeed, they have been, by a large extent, the main driver for the protection of freedom of expression. Unfortunately, as of now, only 3 regions may be said to have in place effective regional human rights system: Europe, the Americas, and Africa. Asia, which is a big continent, and the Middle East are lagging behind the rest of the world, indeed by several decades. Some timid steps have been taken, which I'm going to highlight briefly in this concluding segment. In the Middle East, the League of Arab States adopted the Arab Charter of Human Rights in 2004. It also established the Arab Committee of Human Rights in 2009 to support the implementation of the Arab Charter. Unfortunately, the Charter is largely inconsistent with international human rights standards. For instance, Article 30 of the Charter allows for the imposition of limitations on freedom of thought, conscience, and religion if these are provided by law. And you may recall that under the international and regional system, largely freedom of thought and conscience cannot be derogated. They are just unconditional. The Charter also guarantees the right to seek, receive, and impart information, provided these rights are exercised, and I quote, in conformity with the fundamental values of society. Now, this is an expression which you don't find in any other international instrument, and it is so broad and so imprecise in its meaning that for many observers, and indeed people in the region itself, it loses its meaning as far as the protection of freedom of expression is concerned. As far as the committee itself, critics have highlighted the lack of independence of the members of that Human Rights Committee and basically its inability to play the role it should play, which is to enforce human rights implementation. In Asia-Pacific, there is only one really sub-regional instrument which was established by the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, also known under its acronym of ASEAN. This is a grouping of 10 nation-states, namely Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. And that was founded in 1967, so it's quite old already. It's only in 2012 that the ASEAN adopted a Declaration of Human Rights. And within a minute of its adoption, the declaration was altogether decried and rejected by the international community, civil society, and observers, member states of the United Nations. Just to give you some example, the general principles within the ASEAN Human Rights Charter includes balancing the enjoyment of fundamental rights with government-imposed duties on individuals. It subjects the realization of human rights to regional and national context and to broad and all-encompassing limitations on rights, including rights that should not be restricted. Similarly, the ASEAN has also established a body responsible for overseeing the implementation of its human rights commitment. But again, so far, it has failed to deliver any tangible benefits for human rights. But of course, both Asia and the Middle East are part of and accountable to the international human rights system. So the respect for freedom of expression and information enshrined in Article 19 of the UDHR and Article 19 of the ICCPR apply to the state of those two regions and to the people of those regions, in the same way that it applies to other regions. So what have we learned this week? freedom of expression is a fundamental human right. It is recognized by international and regional human rights conventions binding on member states, the ICCPR and the UDHR, the European Convention on Human Rights binding on Europe, the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights for the member states of that region, and the African Charter for Peoples and Human Rights binding on African member states. These 5 international human rights texts define freedom of expression and information more or less using the same words and in the same terms. It is the freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas in any form, regardless of frontiers. 4 of them identify narrow limits to the exercise of the rights, limits which are also more or less framed in similar terms. Those limits must be defined in law, necessary to a democratic society, and on the basis of eligible grounds. This is the most fundamental framework upon which restriction to freedom of expression is based. And it's very important. The 3-part test is of fundamental importance to the freedom of expression. The principle driving the recognition and protection of freedom of expression are more or less common to all 4 instruments. There is a never again driver. The advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief and freedom from fear and want has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people. That is in the preamble of the UDHR, and I think it is very much at the heart of all of those human rights projects. We never want to see massacres. We never want to see the drama of World War II, the suffering, the killings. Of course, the reality is different, but this is the aspiration, never again. And that is also true for freedom of expression, as I have highlighted in a previous segment. The centrality of freedom of expression to the entire human rights project and vision is also very much part of both the international and regional approach to it. Freedom of information is a fundamental human right. It is a touchstone of all the freedom. It is central to the realization of all other rights. These are the kind of expression that you are finding currently throughout the international human rights system, whether at international level or at regional level. It means that freedom of expression and information are a means of determining how far rights and freedom in general are respected. It is a means through which those rights can also be exercised. And then we've also seen the importance of freedom of expression and freedom of the media to an effective democracy. That was also central both to the international system and to the regional system. Without freedom of expression, without a free media, there is no democracy, there is no public opinion, there is no political parties, there is no ability of the public to understand what their leaders are thinking, what their leaders are doing. There is no democracy, and indeed there is no proper governance. That too is very much central to the construction of the protection of freedom of expression in all 3 regions and internationally. And then there are some specificities. In the Americas, it will be an insistence that there is a collective right to freedom of expression, that it is not just about the right of the self, but it's also about the right of the society to hear and listen the information. And then in the context of Europe, there is this insistence that freedom of expression also include the freedom to offend and freedom to shock, because without that freedom, there is no proper debate and there is no proper democracy. So throughout those regions, you are finding specificities to freedom of expression, which in fact then become cited outside their original region of birth and become part of the overall normative system, which is part of our system of protection for freedom of expression. Next week, we will analyze in greater detail the scope of freedom of expression and the limits to freedom of expression. This will include unpacking the three-part test of legality, necessity, and eligible grounds, as well as looking into another limit to freedom of expression, that of Article 20 of the ICCPR related to incitement to violence and discrimination.